I asked the waiter to deliver the divorce letter and my ring directly to her table. Sitting far away, I watched the scene as if watching a show unfold, but I was in no way prepared for her reaction. She didn't seem embarrassed, or surprised, or remorseful. His eyes wandered from the paper to the ring, and a nervous, almost ironic smile began to form on his face. Her hand was shaking slightly, but not from panic. There was something more there. Something like relief. I saw her every morning and night, and I would never have imagined that what I interpreted as tiredness was perhaps something much deeper, something planned. The lack of interest in conversations, the delays at work, the excuses, everything started to fall into place, like pieces of a puzzle that suddenly start to make sense. And now, in that restaurant in Boston, in that moment, as she received my definitive answer, I finally realized that I had fallen for her game. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a plan, something planned and far beyond a simple adventure. Curiosity consumed me. I wanted to understand what was going through her head, what that expression meant. That cold reaction sent me into an abyss of doubt and despair. I couldn't imagine what she had in mind, but my intuition screamed that this was far from an impulsive mistake. She had planned everything, every step, every detail. That's when she looked up and found me. There was no hesitation, there was no guilt. Just a slight surprise when he saw me, but also a touch of contempt, as if I were an obstacle in his path. She just bowed her head, almost a gesture of thanks to the waiter, and kept the ring in her palm, twirling it between her fingers. And then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, he murmured to his lover beside him, as if I weren't even there, anyway, it's done. The impact of those words hit me like a punch in the gut. It was done. Did she expect this breakup? Did she secretly wish to be freed? Every gesture that once seemed innocent now turned into a piece of a much darker story. I began to see that perhaps I had not just been betrayed, but manipulated, thrown aside in a selfish and cruel plan. I was there, watching my marriage fall apart not because of a mistake, but because of something much more calculated, something that was perhaps irreversible. Still, deep down, a glimmer of hope told me that this was a mistake, that perhaps I was seeing things through lenses distorted by jealousy and pain. But when she picked up the phone, still in front of her lover, and started dialing with a look of indifference, I understood that my presence there meant little, almost nothing. I wasn't the one she thought. Was I just a phase over? I need to resolve this soon, he whispered into the phone, as if my existence were just a bureaucratic issue. She talked about me. And the coldness with which he did it, the way he simply acted as if I were nothing, made it clear how expendable I was in his life. In a second, I realized that everything we experienced was nothing more than an easily forgettable memory, something that she discarded without the slightest remorse. My mind exploded with questions. Had she ever loved anyone? Would you have felt something for me? Or was I just a starting point, a stepping stone to something more that she now so coldly sought? The pain of betrayal was mixed with anger, with the desire to scream, but I remained there, silent, feeling the humiliation burn in my chest. She knew I was there, that I was watching everything, but she didn't show any concern. It was as if I were invisible. I, a man who had built a life alongside her, who had shared dreams, who had created bonds, now found myself reduced to a silent spectator of my own failure. And everything indicated that she was willing to carry this plan to the end, without any hesitation, without going back. She looked once again at her lover, and in an enigmatic whisper, said something I couldn't hear. But his expression said it all. The two of them shared a secret, something I wasn't destined to discover. Something that made her cast one last look in my direction before standing up, with a firm posture, leaving me there, alone with my pain and my empty wedding ring. But what was she hiding? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional and aim to show how much betrayal can destroy people's lives, leaving deep marks and irreversible consequences. Get ready to dive into a shocking story, full of twists and intense emotions. Enjoy and good story. The couple had been together for more than a decade. Amanda and Richard formed an enviable duo for many. They met when they were young, in one of those moments when life seems to conspire to bring two people together with an almost magical intensity. Richard was a successful businessman with a sharp mind for numbers and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends. He dedicated himself to his work with passion, always seeking the best to ensure a comfortable life for Amanda and the two children he loved so much. He was someone with a strong temperament, but balanced, someone who liked to control details, to plan the future with precision and security. Amanda, on the other hand, had a freer essence, a soul that sought enchantment in the little things in life. He loved art, spending hours in his home studio, where he painted pictures that he rarely showed to anyone other than Richard. Art was his refuge, his way of dealing with the world and with the deepest feelings that he avoided exposing. With a light smile and natural charm, Amanda was the type of person who attracted glances and conversations wherever she went. Her beauty was not just external, it was a beauty that transcended, something that Richard deeply admired and loved from the first moment he saw her. The house they built together represented every aspect of the dream they shared. A classic, spacious and welcoming building, full of memories and details that Amanda insisted on adding her own touches. For her, each piece of furniture, each painting and each photograph were essential to building an environment of love and history. It was as if Amanda wanted to print a piece of herself in every corner of the house, a kind of living mural of the life they chose to build together. For Richard, the house was a symbol of achievement. It was what he was proud to call home, the place where he felt safe and where he could relax after long days of work. He wanted to provide comfort and stability, something he didn't have in his childhood and which he now made a point of ensuring for his family. The relationship between the two, over the years, became a solid, almost predictable routine, but for Richard, this had never been a problem. For him, this stability was proof that the relationship was maturing, that both had found balance. The conversations were always practical and objective, focused on the well-being of the family, the future of the children and everyday responsibilities. The love seemed to be there, embedded in small gestures and constant presence, even if it wasn't the same as it was in the early years. Amanda, however, was beginning to feel an uneasiness that she couldn't fully understand. The studio where he spent hours on end no longer brought the same relief, and his paintings seemed to lose their shine. She spent long periods staring at the blank screen, trying to translate into color something that seemed unnameable, a vague sense of dissatisfaction that she dared not share with anyone, least of all Richard. She knew Richard loved the life they had built, and what he valued most was the stability and comfort they had achieved together. Amanda feared breaking this harmony by expressing her own feelings, which were so confusing and, for her, perhaps even unfair. The couple's two children were teenagers and were always busy with their own worlds, with the concerns and passions typical of their age. Richard was often busy with them, participating in school and sports activities, being the present father he never had. He felt it was his role to train young people who were responsible and prepared for the future. Amanda, although present, felt that the children's phase separated her from them, as if there was an invisible barrier that prevented her from connecting with them in the same way as before. She didn't know how to overcome this wall and, at the same time, she felt that it was a reflection of what was going on inside her. Little by little, Amanda began to spend more time outside the home, dedicating herself to art events, exhibitions, and meetings with a small circle of friends who shared her interests. She told herself that she needed this, that these activities filled a void that her home routine could no longer fill. Richard noticed this change, but never questioned it. He trusted Amanda, respected her need for freedom, and to some degree felt that these moments were important to her. It was his way of keeping the relationship healthy, giving her space to explore herself and her interests. For him, every time she left and came back, it was like reaffirming the trust they had built over the years. Still, Richard couldn't help but feel a certain discomfort that was growing subtly and steadily. There was something about Amanda's expression when she came home that he couldn't define. It was as if she brought with her a piece of another world, a world he didn't belong to. He tried to push away this thought, thinking it was just an irrational insecurity, the result of responsibilities and the natural wear and tear of life. However, each time she left, he noticed that this feeling intensified. One night, after a family dinner, Richard decided to make a proposal. He suggested a trip, something to revitalize the relationship, maybe a second honeymoon. He thought it could be a good way to remember what they had together, away from the distractions of everyday life. But Amanda's reaction surprised him. She hesitated, showed a pale smile and, evasively, said that she couldn't, that there were commitments, responsibilities that prevented her. Richard tried to hide his disappointment, but that answer, although simple, had a profound impact. He felt for the first time a real distance between them, as if an invisible abyss was beginning to form. The following weeks were marked by awkward silences and furtive glances. Amanda continued to leave frequently, returning late and avoiding deeper conversations. Richard, on the other hand, became increasingly immersed in his work, seeking the order and control in his professional environment that he seemed to lose at home. He was beginning to wonder if the problem was with him, if his dedication to work and financial stability had not become an invisible prison for Amanda. Despite everything, the two continued to keep up appearances. For their friends and family, they were still the perfect, harmonious and happy couple. They attended events together, smiled, talked about their children and family achievements. But, behind the scenes, everyone faced their own anguish, their own doubts and insecurities. Amanda seemed increasingly distant, while Richard wondered if there was still anything he could do to rescue the love that once brought them together so intensely. On a rainy night, after another of Amanda's outings, Richard was sitting on the living room sofa, lost in thought, when she walked through the door with a thoughtful, almost enigmatic expression. She walked over to him, sat down next to him, and for the first time in a long time, held his hand. They didn't say anything, but in that silence, they both felt that something was changing. Amanda looked straight ahead, avoiding looking at him, as if that proximity was both comforting and painful. At that moment, Richard felt a mixture of hope and anguish. He wanted to believe that that gesture was the first step towards reconciliation, towards reclaiming what they had, but something inside him said that there was still much to come. Amanda, in turn, squeezed his hand tightly, as if that touch were the last connection with a life that was beginning to seem distant. It was as if, somehow, they both knew they were at a point of no return, a turning point that would change their lives forever. Amanda felt increasingly distant from the life she had with Richard. There was a fine line between familiarity and suffocation, a line she crossed in thought as she drove through the empty streets, returning home from her artistic gatherings and social events. With every kilometer he traveled, he felt a growing weight on his shoulders, a feeling that he was about to betray something deeper than his union. Try as he might, Richard's presence seemed to dissipate into a fog of duty and convention, while another side of him, long repressed, fought to emerge. Richard, although dedicating himself to work and his children, felt Amanda's increasing absence. He saw how she seemed increasingly alienated from the life they had built together, a universe he deeply believed in. Every time he watched her, he knew something was slipping through his fingers, something he couldn't name, but it haunted him like a dense shadow. On his sleepless nights, he thought about the first years of marriage, the laughter shared, the promises made. Now, however, those memories seemed distant, almost unreal, like a dream that faded every time he tried to touch it. One day, seeing Amanda leaving with a restrained expression, Richard had an impulse. He decided to follow her, not out of distrust, but out of a need to understand what was happening to her. Maybe, he thought, she needed something he hadn't noticed, a spark that could rekindle what they were missing. It was a way of reconnecting, of trying to rescue something he feared was about to disappear. He followed her to an art gallery in an upscale neighborhood, where she met up with a group of people. Richard hid in the shadows, watching from afar, feeling both foolish and invading her privacy. He watched as Amanda talked animatedly, smiling with a lightness he hadn't seen in years. He also noticed that there was one man in particular who she spoke to with a twinkle in her eye, someone she looked at with an attention he hadn't seen in a while. It was a look that no longer belonged to him, a look that evoked bitter memories of a passion that he thought was his alone. In the days that followed, Richard tried to ignore what he had seen, but he couldn't shake the images from his mind. He followed her again on a few more occasions, unable to resist the urge to observe this new Amanda that he barely recognized. The man he had seen before was always around, always engaged in private conversations and shared smiles. Richard now felt the ice of suspicion penetrating his thoughts, something that left him in a state of constant alert. He tried, in vain, to divert his mind to work, but with every call, with every message Amanda received, he wondered what was really going on. One night, when she returned home later than usual, Richard decided to confront her. He waited for her to settle down, taking a deep breath before finally asking, in a low and controlled voice, "Amanda, do you still love me?" The question echoed through the room like unexpected thunder. Amanda, taken by surprise, hesitated. The smile he always used to ease any discomfort faded, giving way to an expression filled with doubt. She looked at him, trying to formulate an answer that wasn't a complete lie, but also not knowing how to avoid the truth. "Richard, she began, but the words were lost. He continued to observe her, looking for some sign, some answer that would alleviate her anguish. Amanda looked away, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overflow. She knew that, when facing him, she would not be able to hide the contradictions that consumed her. She found herself torn between the desire to protect what they built and the desire for something that even she couldn't explain. To avoid an argument she knew she couldn't lead, Amanda changed the subject, diverting attention to a trivial issue, and Richard, feeling that insisting would only alienate her further, relented. The days passed, and Richard, tormented by uncertainty, began to notice the smallest details. I noticed when she chose perfume she had never worn before, when her cell phone vibrated with messages that she discreetly checked. He tried to convince himself that it was just paranoia, but something inside him screamed that the situation was much more serious than he imagined. Then, on a cold autumn night, Richard made a decision. He had planned a business trip that would keep him away for a few days. It was the perfect time to understand what was happening while he wasn't home. In secret, he devised a strategy. He asked a close friend to keep an eye on the house and, especially, on Amanda. It was an extreme gesture, and he felt guilty, but he needed to know the truth. During the trip, his friend's messages were scarce, but filled with a tone that only increased his anguish. Richard could no longer concentrate on anything. With each notification, your heart accelerated, your breath caught. The last message, received at the end of the trip, contained just one sentence: "I need to tell you in person. It is serious." The return home was tense. He drove with his mind filled with anxiety, unable to imagine what awaited him. Upon meeting his friend again, everything he feared became reality. He received confirmation that on the nights he was away, Amanda had received visitors. The visitor, a man, left early in the morning, after hours of smiling and exchanging caresses that his friend reported with a mixture of pity and regret. Richard didn't know how to deal with that information. It was as if a hidden truth was coming to light, revealing the extent of the abyss that separated them. He decided not to confront her right away. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, feel the pain on his skin before jumping to any conclusions. And so, the next night, when Amanda mentioned that she would need to go out again, he remained silent, just nodding with a slight nod of his head. He waited a few minutes after she left and then followed her. The route was familiar: a gallery, an elegant cafe and, finally, a small boutique hotel. He watched as Amanda entered the place with the same man she had seen before. He waited for a few minutes, trying to understand what that scene meant for him, trying to absorb the weight of that betrayal that he didn't want to believe was true. When he finally worked up the courage and entered the hotel, he went straight to the counter, where he asked for her room number, mentioning an important appointment. The receptionist, although suspicious, relented, allowing Richard to approach the room where Amanda was. He walked down the hallway, feeling pain mixed with anger rising in his chest. When he arrived at the door, everything was confirmed. Hearing low voices and muffled laughter, Richard felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. There was no more doubt, there was no way to be mistaken. Amanda was cheating on him, and that revelation shattered him, leaving him floored, breathless. Richard, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with bitter thoughts, waited patiently until dawn. Amanda had returned late, and he knew that that would be the decisive night. With every detail of what he had seen at the hotel etched in his mind, he felt the weight of the truth. The betrayal was exposed, but the reasons and scope of it all remained to be understood. He needed the answers she had been so skillfully avoiding. That morning, Richard prepared breakfast and waited in the living room, in silence, until Amanda came downstairs. She seemed confused to see her husband there, with a harder expression than usual. He didn't let her deviate, he didn't give her room for evasions. When she approached, Richard spoke directly, his voice carrying a tense calm. "We need to talk, Amanda. Sit down." Amanda hesitated, but knew there was no point in running away. She sat across from him, avoiding his gaze, her uneasy posture reflecting the discomfort she felt. The room seemed to shrink as the silence stretched on. Finally, Richard broke the ice, with a question that echoed all the anguish accumulated over the last few days. "Why?" "I just want to understand, Amanda. I just want to know, what happened to us?" She took a deep breath, running her hands through her hair, trying to find the right words. "I knew there was no easy explanation, but at that moment, there was no way around the situation." He looked at him with a look full of uncertainty and began, "I don't know, Richard. I don't know when everything started to disconnect. But I felt like I was disappearing here, like the life we built was a cage, and I needed to find something that reminded me of who I am." He clenched his hands, trying to control the anger and pain. He felt betrayed, but also hurt by the realization that, in some way, perhaps he really had failed her. However, that didn't justify what she had done. Richard wasn't ready to accept that emptiness for an answer. "A cage, Amanda? Is this how you see our life?" His voice was cold, but there was no hiding the hurt tone. She closed her eyes, working up the courage to speak, but she hesitated for a second, as if choosing her words carefully. "Richard, I know you were always there, you always worked so hard for us. I just can't do it anymore." Her voice trailed off, and she lowered her head, as if she were losing the strength to continue. Richard, taking a deep breath to control the whirlwind of emotions, fixed his gaze on her, pressing her to be honest. "Is that all? Or is there more?" He hesitated, but added in a sharp tone, "This man, Amanda. Is it part of this need to remember who you are? Or is there something beyond that you're hiding from me?" Amanda trembled when she heard her lover's name mentioned, and realized that Richard knew more than she realized. She tried to maintain her composure, but she couldn't stop a lone tear from running down her face. He decided it was time to give up the lies. "Richard, I'm sorry, but I got involved. With him, yes. And it wasn't just a mistake, it was more than that." Richard felt the ground crumble beneath his feet, even though he was already expecting the confession. But what hit him like a blow was what Amanda said next, almost in a whisper, "And he wants me out of this house, Richard. He thinks that you're going to want to take me away from our kids, but he said we can fight for me to keep them." Anger and pain washed over Richard in an overwhelming wave. He stood up abruptly, his voice brimming with indignation. He said, "What? Does he think he's going to give you the right to keep our children after all this? What kind of man is he, Amanda? What kind of mother are you becoming to believe that you can throw our children into the middle of this adventure of yours?" Amanda closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Richard's words pierce through every layer of apology she was trying to form. She knew that her lover, although present, had not actually shown the interest she believed he had. But it was already too late. What Richard had just heard was out of control. I don't know what happened, Richard. I just know, that I felt alive again, that I could breathe. But I swear, this was never about our kids. I would never, and he knows that." Richard interrupted, exasperated. "Does he know that our children are not part of his plan? Or does he just see you as another game he thinks he can manipulate?" Amanda was silent, realizing that Richard was getting straight to the point. Her lover had proven more manipulative than she cared to admit. She felt used, but at the same time, torn between guilt and a desperate attempt to protect something she herself had destroyed. "I never wanted things to go this far," she whispered, almost voiceless. Richard looked at her with a mix of contempt and compassion, trying to process the revelations and doubts that consumed him. He knew that the trust between them was completely destroyed, but he needed to understand where that went. "Are you willing to sacrifice our family for a man who doesn't even respect you? Because, Amanda, if that's what you want, if you really think this man is worth it, then go. But don't think I'm going to allow him into our children's lives." Amanda felt lost, torn between what she thought was a search for herself and the price that extramarital relationship had just exposed in such a devastating way. He realized, for the first time, how deep the abyss into which he had thrown himself was. He tried to justify his actions, he tried to express the pain he carried and that he thought Richard would never understand, but he felt that no words would ease the burden of his choices. "Richard, I don't know what to say. I'm very sorry." "I'm so sorry," she murmured, finally looking at him sincerely. But Richard was exhausted, his eyes hardened, as if all the emotion he had for her was slowly slipping away. "I feel it too, Amanda. I feel for us. I feel for our children, for our history, for what I thought we had. But maybe I was wrong about you, about all of this." They remained silent, facing what was left of that conversation, that relationship and everything they had built together. After the eye-opening argument, Richard felt a bitter mix of relief and pain, a weight he now carried deeper and heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He couldn't find a clear direction, all he knew was that he needed to move away, create a barrier between him and Amanda, something that would protect him from what remained of his feelings for her. The impact of her words reverberated in his mind, like a painful echo that never ceased. That night, he decided not to sleep at home. He grabbed his car keys, left a quick message for his children saying they needed time to process certain changes, and left without an exact destination. He wasn't sure where to go, but he knew he needed distance. For hours, he drove along the dark roads, his mind saturated with images and dialogues that he couldn't erase. While Richard wandered off in search of some kind of peace, Amanda, at home, felt crushed by the silence that remained. She remained in the living room, lost among memories and regrets, unable to find solace in any part of the house that, until recently, was her home. She had chosen a path, and now she was dealing with devastating consequences that she had never imagined facing so directly. Each room seemed a testament to her decisions, each wall a silent accusation that she could not refute. Deep down, she knew that something in her relationship with Richard had been lost, something that she had neglected and that now seemed irretrievable. The next morning, Richard returned early, just to get some documents and talk briefly with his children. They felt the heavy atmosphere, the pulsating tension that seemed to hang in the air, and they didn't dare ask anything more than was necessary. Richard tried to be firm, but with each word exchanged, his heart broke a little more. He avoided looking into Amanda's eyes, who, in turn, watched him with a mixture of guilt and regret, fighting back the tears that threatened to appear at any moment. With a firm tone, he finally addressed her, without any trace of apparent emotion, "We need some time, Amanda. I need clarity to make the right decisions, to understand what we are going to do from now on." She nodded, knowing that insisting or trying to explain again would be in vain. Richard was determined to walk away, and deep down, she understood why. He needed to process everything, and she herself needed to deal with the destruction she had caused. Richard decided he would temporarily move into a small rented apartment. During the following weeks, he dedicated himself to work and his children, trying to maintain a balance so that the impact of the separation was as small as possible. However, he knew that the pain was a constant shadow, something that accompanied him in every silent moment, invading his mind when he was alone. His closest friends noticed the change in his behavior, but Richard remained reserved, without sharing the details of the situation. It was as if he was carrying an invisible burden, something only he could bear. Meanwhile, Amanda experienced a painful new reality. Without Richard by her side, the days seemed long, empty and full of memories that now haunted her. The lover, who previously seemed to be an escape valve, was also absent. He seemed more distant and disinterested, and Amanda began to realize how much she had deluded herself into thinking that this relationship could mean something true or profound. He treated her coldly, and, little by little, she began to question whether that man really cared or if it was just another one of his passing games. On a dark afternoon, Amanda tried, for the last time, to confront her lover, to seek an explanation, something that would give her an answer to the confusion her life had become. He listened to her with a bored, almost indifferent look, and, bluntly, declared, "Look, Amanda, I never promised anything more than what we had. You knew how things would be. I thought that's what you wanted, something uncompromising, something light." Those words were the final blow. Amanda felt as if a curtain had fallen, revealing a truth she had refused to see. He had never considered her more than a distraction, a convenient pastime. And, upon realizing this, it was as if all the choices I had made became even heavier and more definitive. Richard was right in his accusations. Her lover had been a terrible mistake, a selfish escape that had cost her far more than she could bear. When she returned home, she felt consumed by guilt, pain, and regret. She knew that, at this point, her reconciliation with Richard seemed like a distant dream, something almost impossible. He would never forgive her. Amanda felt like she had lost the right to ask anything of him. Now, his biggest fear was also losing his children's respect and trust. She tried to maintain her composure, to act so that they wouldn't feel the weight of her pain, but inside, everything about her was falling apart. Richard, on the other hand, faced his own dilemma. He loved Amanda, despite everything, and that was the bitterest truth he carried. No matter what she had done, the depth of love he felt remained intact, and it made him question his own choices, his own ability to move forward. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, forgetting was not an option. The only question left was, would he be able to forgive her? The days passed, and Richard found himself increasingly tormented by the weight of his decision. He understood that the betrayal was a consequence of years of silence and disconnection, and as much as it hurt him, he also realized that they both had responsibility for the cracks in that relationship. His heart was divided between anger and love, between the desire to move forward and the need to protect the family he had built. Then one day, Richard decided to meet with Amanda to discuss the future. He arranged a meeting in a discreet cafe, away from familiar eyes, where they could talk openly, without interruptions. When Amanda arrived, she looked more fragile than ever, her face marked by sadness and the weight of the choices she had made. Richard took a deep breath before starting to speak. He watched her every move, trying to understand the woman in front of him, so different from the one he had met so many years ago. "Amanda, I can't erase what you did, nor the pain it caused," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "But I also can't ignore the fact that our children deserve a united family, something that strengthens them. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I know that they are not to blame for our failures." She listened to him in silence, absorbing every word, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. When he finally responded, his voice was barely a whisper, but there was a deep sincerity in every word. "I understand, Richard. I know what I did is unforgivable. I destroyed everything, and if I could, I would take it back. But, even if I don't have your forgiveness, I want to be there for them. I want to be a better mother, a better person." Richard nodded, realizing that Amanda was being honest. For the first time in a long time, he felt there was a truth between them, something that could, perhaps, be the beginning of a redemption, if not for their marriage, at least for what was left of their family. The two were silent for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Richard knew that the path he would choose would be difficult and that the scars would remain, but perhaps, somehow, he could find a way to overcome that pain. When they said goodbye, they both carried a new kind of understanding. There was still a lot to be resolved, a lot to be discussed, but for the first time, they both had a direction. The final decision was made with a weight that seemed impossible to bear. Richard and Amanda met again to formally discuss the terms of a permanent separation. They knew there was no going back. Even with their children as a common link, both understood that trust, once broken in that way, could hardly be restored. With the support of a family lawyer, Richard and Amanda organized the custody details of their children. Richard, despite everything, wanted them to continue seeing their mother, but under the condition of careful coexistence, without the external involvement and influences that had destroyed their home. Amanda agreed, understanding the seriousness of the request, realizing the profound impact her actions had, not only on the marriage, but on the emotional structure of the family. She didn't question the conditions. The pain of separation and the shame were almost unbearable. He accepted each clause, aware that he was beginning a new chapter in his life, a chapter filled with loss and regret. After the separation was formalized, Amanda moved to a small apartment. For her, this was a lonely new beginning, the consequence of her choices, something that reminded her daily of what she had destroyed. She tried to occupy her mind with art, but inspiration seemed absent. Her paintings, once so vibrant, now reflected shadows and somber tones, as if they were translating the pain and emptiness that took over her. On cold and lonely nights, Amanda questioned herself about the moments that led her there, going over each decision, each mistake. Pain was his constant companion, a silent reminder that sometimes mistakes cannot be erased. Richard, on the other hand, turned his focus to his children. He found renewed purpose in devoting himself entirely to them, seeking to rebuild the trust and stability that had been shaken. His days, previously filled with incessant work, were now planned around time with his children, activities that he previously delegated, but which were now part of his routine. He wanted them to understand that, despite everything, they still had a present and dedicated father. But Richard couldn't escape the pain that Amanda had left behind. At night, alone, he faced the void left by the love and trust he had once shared with her. No matter how much he tried to move on, memories appeared in his mind, bringing the bitterness of a betrayal that he couldn't forget. He understood that forgiveness was a long road, something he might never be able to fully achieve. Months later, on a spring afternoon, Amanda tried to make one last contact with him. She wrote a letter, a farewell that carried the weight of all the words she had never said. The letter was a confession, an exposition of everything she had felt and the regret that consumed her. She wrote about loneliness, about the choices she made and the price she paid for them. He described how he now understood the extent of the losses he had caused, how he accepted the consequences of his actions. He knew that none of that would bring him back, but he felt that he needed to say everything, as a way of freeing himself, even if just to face life with a minimum of peace. Upon receiving the letter, Richard read each line with a heavy heart. Amanda's words, sincere and sad, moved him in a way he hadn't expected. He felt a mixture of compassion and sadness, a reminder of the love they had shared that now only existed in memories. Richard put the letter in a drawer, without responding, but with a certain relief. It was the end of a cycle, a kind of closure he needed to leave the past behind. Amanda, after sending the letter, decided it was time to leave permanently. She realized that staying in the city, where every corner reminded her of her old life, would only prolong the suffering. She moved to a distant place, seeking to truly start over, far from everything and everyone who had once been part of what she herself had destroyed. She knew that loneliness would be her new companion, but she accepted it as part of the price she had to pay. As for her lover, his presence in Amanda's life quickly dissolved after the divorce. He had moved on, making it clear that his involvement had never been more than a pastime, something without a future. Amanda, upon realizing this, felt a mixture of humiliation and shame, finally understanding the emptiness that relationship really meant. To him, Amanda was nothing more than a passing memory, a name he wouldn't even mention in the future. Richard eventually found a new serenity. The pain of betrayal shaped him in profound ways, but he learned to look to the future with optimism. Alongside his children, he rediscovered the strength he had and the importance of rebuilding a life guided by truth and respect. The years that followed were ones of growth and learning, and despite the scars, he felt he had overcome the trauma, ready to leave the past in its place. And so, Richard and Amanda's story ended with a bitter realization: love, when irreparably wounded, cannot be restored, only transformed into memory and learning. Amanda continued her life elsewhere, forever marked by pain and regret, while Richard and his children rebuilt a new reality, guided by overcoming and mutual respect. Comment below what you thought of this story and share your opinion on the endings. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this, where we seek to explore the consequences of betrayal and life's complex dilemmas. And remember, here, we never support any type of betrayal.